isolate and detoxify the area. So I've been involved with workers who've suffered significant brain damage from being involved in some of these Superfund sites, as well as I've been involved in some of the NFL concussion lawsuits. There have been a lot of NFL football players who suffered chronic traumatic encephalopathies, and so I've been involved in some of the NFL lawsuits as well.
Okay. Now, let's kind of shift gears a little bit here, sir. Tell the jury, in your words, generally, what is a PET scan?
A PET scan is a way of looking at brain function. So most conventional brain imaging looks at the structure of the brain, but with a lot of traumatic brain injuries, you might have an intact brain structure, but you might have a malfunction of the brain. And so a conventional CT or MRI scan is oftentimes insensitive at detecting these things. As a matter of fact, you can actually take a cadaver and place a cadaver in an MRI scan and get a normal MRI of the brain because the shape and structure of the cadaver's brain is normal. But if you were to try and place a cadaver's brain inside a PET scan, you would get a blank screen because there's no sugar being consumed in the brain. And so this is just one example of how the ability to look at the function of the brain is much more sensitive at detecting clinical conditions than just looking at the structure of the brain. Or another example are patients, for example, who might be comatose. And again, you can take a patient who's comatose, you can place them in a CT or MRI scan, and you might get a perfectly normal CT or MRI scan of the brain because the comatose patient's brain is perfectly normally shaped. But the function of the comatose patient's brain is severely abnormal. And so instead of a blank screen, like you might get with a cadaver, you might get a screen that shows very little sugar metabolism compared to a normal brain. So this is a second example of how the ability to look at the function of the brain is much better for some conditions than the ability to look at the structure or shape of the brain. And so PET scans look at sugar metabolism, and we use a special kind of radioactive sugar to allow us to look at brain function.
All right, and so essentially this machine, this imaging machine, the PET, where you do the PET scan, it allows medical professionals to examine someone's brain in lieu of having to open up their skull and do surgery. Is that fair to say?
Yes. I mean, before, it was literally impossible to be able to look at the function of the brain, and all you could do was look at the structure of the brain. But then about 30 years ago, scientists developed a way of looking inside the living human brain and being able to look at the sugar metabolism. And this opened up a whole new window for psychiatrists and neurologists to be able to better understand their patients.
All right. And so PET scans in general, just as a general concept, I finally got busted here, Judge. I am technologically a dinosaur. I might have hit something here. But
need help?
I don't think so just yet.
Okay.
All right, thank you. All right, sir. So these machines obviously are very useful to many different aspects of medical field, not just what we're doing here today.
That's correct. And so now PET scans are being used, for example, in the assessment of Alzheimer's disease. And Medicare actually pays for PET scans to be used in Alzheimer's disease because they are much more sensitive than conventional MRI, CT scans at even detecting things like Alzheimer's disease.
All right, sir. Now, these PET scan machines, they are assuming they are all over the country, correct?
That's correct.
All right. There's many in California.
That's correct.
There's many in Florida.
That's correct.
All right. Now, as far as getting a little bit more detailed, are there different types of PET scans that can be administered?
There are different types of PET scans. So, for example, the main type of PET scan that is used involves looking at radioactive sugar molecule, but you can also look at other things. For example, if you're looking at Parkinson's disease, you can look at what we call radioactive DOPA. DOPA is the agent, is what we call the precursor or the chemical that you need to make dopamine. And dopamine is very low in Parkinson's disease, so you can look at patients with Parkinson's disease with radioactive Doppler scans. So there are other types of scans that people are developing. So they're trying to develop new scans all the time, so looking at different chemicals.
All right. And I know we talked earlier about your articles and publications. I did forget to ask you this. Do you know roughly how many of the 60 plus you've had peer review published dealt with PET scans?
I would say probably 50 out of 60 is dealt with PET scans.
All right. Now, to help your presentation in court, did you prepare some type of PowerPoint presentation that we could utilize and show some images to help you explain your testimony?
Yes, I prepared a PowerPoint to try and show the jury more about the PET scans, because it's a lot easier to show a picture and it's a lot easier to understand if you see a picture for PET scanning. And so I prepared a PowerPoint trying to help assist the jury in better understanding the technology and the findings that we see in Mr. Toledo.
All right, Judge, just 1 second.
I do have a question.
Sorry?
Is this been admitted as evidence or is for demonstrative purposes?
Demonstrative purpose is what we're going to do on the slideshow, Your Honor.
Then I'll instruct the jury is for your benefit, but this is not evidence. You will not be able to take it back to the jury room.
All right, Your Honor, if you
And I want to clarify, it's a PowerPoint, right?
correct.
Okay, I've never seen it, so I guess I'll.
Judge, you want me to, I can come up and explain it to the bench if you want, but
No, so long as there's an agreement, I'm okay with it.
right.
I'll turn the screen on for him so he can look at it on, or you already have it on your own?
Well, I have a second copy.
Okay, I'll turn this monitor on. Are you ready for this?
yes.
Okay. Then I'll just come off the bench and, because I can't really see.
Dr. Wu, you have it on that little one, right?
Yes.
All right, let Judge Zambrano use that.
Oh, no, it's okay because he won't know which slide you're on.
Yeah, he has it simultaneously, Judge.
Oh, okay, all right, thank you.
All right. Thank you, Your Honor. Okay, Dr. Wu, so we're going to go through, some slides here. Just read that or explain why you have that in there.
Well, this is just to indicate that PET scans are a more advanced and more sensitive technique for detection of TBI, which stands for traumatic brain injury, and that PET is short for positron emission tomography. And let's see. And so a positron is what we call a short for positive electrons. Now, as you may recall from basic physics, electrons in our universe are normally negatively charged. We can create what we call the antimatter version of an electron, which is identical, except that it is positively charged. Now, antimatter doesn't really exist very long in our universe because antimatter is attracted to matter, and when they combine, you release energy. And so in order to make the positron emitter, we need a machine called a cyclotron, which I will show you in a few slides. But so that's basically what PET scan stands for. It's positron emission tomography, and it's a much more sensitive and advanced way of assessing traumatic brain injury.
Okay, and it can show specific regions of the brain itself, correct?
Yes, and so we can look at whether there are specific areas of the brain that have a specific abnormality, whether it's either overactive or underactive, by whether it's burning too little or too much of the sugar.
Next slide.
And so,
are you ready for the next slide?
yes, I'm ready for the next slide. So PET scans have been generally accepted as a valid tool for the assessment of brain sugar metabolism. There are literally thousands of articles that have been published in the scientific and medical literature on PET scans' ability to detect sugar metabolism in different regions of the brain, like the frontal and temporal cortex. And so this is a well-accepted scientific and medical test for measuring brain metabolism.
All right, now, what are we looking at with these images here, Dr. Wu?
So these images show a typical MRI scan versus a typical PET scan, and for the same slice. And so the MRI scan shows the structure and shape of the brain, and it shows the gray and white matter. And the PET scan shows the sugar metabolism. And the sugar is color-coded, so the areas of the brain that burn a lot of sugar are colored hot colors like red. And it uses a rainbow scale, red, yellow, orange, green, blue. And so areas of the brain that are very cold and burn very little sugar will be color-coded cool color, like blue. And so areas that are intermediately high will be colored yellow, and areas that are intermediately low will be colored green. And so what we're looking at here is how much sugar is being consumed in different parts of the brain. And so you can see that there is for example, on the bottom slide, you'll see that there's a lot of red at the top of what we call MHS10. If you look at MHS10, there's a red at the top of that area. So if you were to impose an imaginary clock face on top of the PET scan, so that 12 o'clock is at the very top and 6 o'clock is at the very bottom, and if you look at the area that goes from approximately 10 o'clock to 2 o'clock, you'll see that there's a lot of red in that area. Red means that there's a lot of sugar being consumed in that area. That's a part of what we call the frontal lobe of the brain. And if you look at the back of the brain, there's less red, and that's a part of what we call the occipital lobe or cerebellum, and on the side you'll see what we call a temporal lobe. So these are just different slices of the brain, and they show this is a typical normal pattern of sugar metabolism.
All right, Dr. Wu, just so we're oriented correctly here, these pictures, the 3 under the column for PET and the 3 under for MRI, those are overhead looks of the brain, but after part of the top of it's been taken off. Is that correct?
Yes, it's as if you took a metaphorical buzzsaw and sliced off the brain and took it at that level. So you can see the blue slice, the red slice, and the yellow slice are where the different slices correspond to on these 3 images.
Okay, and that's much different than the MRI, which just showed, like you were saying earlier, just shows the round structure of the brain.
Yeah, MRI shows the structure of the brain. So if this were a cadaver, the PET scan would be blank, whereas the MRI scan might look perfectly the same. Or if this was someone in a coma, again, the PET scan, instead of being completely blank or black, it might be all blue. And the MRI might look exactly the same. And so you can see how the ability to look at sugar metabolism provides a lot more information that's just looking at the shape and structure of the MRI of the brain cannot provide, because you can't even tell if someone's dead or in a coma from the MRI sometimes, whereas with a PET scan it would be very easy to tell if someone's dead or in a coma. And so you can look at other things like various types of traumatic brain injuries or other conditions, seizure disorders, and detect abnormalities with the sugar metabolism that you cannot see with an MRI or CAT scan.
And let me ask before I forget, the samples that are under the PET scan column are in color. Do they also, the machines do PET scan images that are in black and white?
Well, the color scale is can be shown in black and white too. There's what we call a lookup table. And the lookup table says if you have high sugar metabolism, you can choose a color lookup table so that areas of the brain that burn a lot of sugar will be assigned red colors, and areas of the brain that are burning very low amounts of sugar are assigned blue colors. But you can use what we call a grayscale lookup table so that areas of the brain that burn a lot of sugar will be very light, and areas of the brain that are burning very little sugar will be very dark. And so there are many different kinds of what we call lookup tables. And so the lookup table is basically assign the color or shade of gray to a specific amount of sugar being consumed.
All right. Ready for the next slide?
Sure.
Did I go backwards? No. No, this is right. Go ahead, sir.
Okay, so as I mentioned, positron emission tomography is short for positron. And as I previously mentioned, most electrons in a universe are negatively charged. Now you can create an antimatter version of an electron called a positron, a positive electron. And the advantage is that when you attach a positron emitter to a sugar molecule, and that positron emitter is taken up by a part of the brain, say the frontal lobe, and the positron comes off the emitter, it will combine with electrons in the brain, and it will be converted into energy rays. And using Einstein's famous equation, E equals mc squared, where E equals energy and m equals mass. And so the mass in the electron or the positron is converted into energy rays by a process which we call an annihilation decay. And if any of you are science fiction fans, you may remember the show Star Trek, in which the USS Enterprise was powered by a matter-antimatter engine. While that show was science fiction, the basic physics principle that the combination of matter and antimatter creates tremendous energy is in fact a well-accepted physics principle, and it's the same principle that underlies PET scanning, except that instead of using the matter-antimatter energy interaction to drive a starship, we're using this to look inside the living human brain to see how much sugar is being consumed in different parts of the brain.
All right, what are we looking at here, sir?
Well, in order to create a positron emitter, we need this machine here called a cyclotron. And if you look carefully, you'll see that there are two triangles on the right and left side of the machine. And if we move to the next slide, please. This is a schematic showing the same machine. And the two triangles are very powerful magnets. And you take a charged subatomic particle smaller than an atom, and then you use the magnets and you alternately either attract or repel the charged subatomic particle so that it is pulled toward the magnet or pushed away from the magnet. And with each revolution, the charged subatomic particle goes faster and faster. So this is kind of like being on a merry-go-round, where you're slapping the merry-go-round and you're getting the merry-go-round to go faster and faster. And so by the time the charged subatomic particle comes out of the cyclotron, it is traveling at almost the speed of light, which is approximately 186,000 miles a second. So it's traveling like 99.99% the speed of light, and the charged subatomic particle will then bombard the target and will create something which doesn't normally exist in our universe, fluorine-18, which is a positron emitter. The reason why fluorine-18 doesn't normally exist in our universe is because fluorine-18 has approximately 2-hour half-life. And so after 6 half-lives, it essentially disappears entirely. And so we use the fluorine-18, which is created every morning in the cyclotron, to attach to a sugar molecule and to create our positron emitters. And so if we can move on to the next slide, please. And so 18, which is a positron emitter, we have a radiochemist who attach the positron emitting fluorine-18 to a sugar molecule. And as I mentioned, sugar is the main fuel for the brain. Sugar is like the gasoline for the engine of a car. So when the neurons are firing, they need a lot of sugar. Just like when an engine is going very fast, it needs a lot of gasoline. And so you can look at different parts of the brain to see how much sugar is being consumed, to see how much the neurons are firing in that part of the brain. Now, in order to attach the fluorine-18 positron emitter to a sugar molecule, you need to have a hot cell. And if we could move on to the next slide, please. The next slide shows a radiochemist, and he is standing in front of a thick leaded glass window. And that thick leaded glass window shields radiochemists from the radiation from the fluorine-18. And so the fluorine-18 has been made in a cyclotron and is inside the hot cell, and through the thick leaded glass window, the radiochemist is able to attach the fluorine-18 to a sugar molecule so that it can then be injected into the patient. And so if we can move on to the next slide, please. In order to inject the fluorine-18 positron-emitting sugar molecule inside the patient, you need to put a small plastic tube in the arm called an intravenous line. Can we move on to the next slide, please? And so here is a picture of a model who is getting an intravenous line being placed in his arm so that the radioactive sugar molecule, the fluorine-18 deoxyglucose, can be injected into the patient's bloodstream. And once it's injected in the patient's bloodstream, the sugar molecule will be taken up by parts of the brain in proportion to the amount of firing that occurs in that part of the brain. So areas of the brain that are firing a lot of neurons will need a lot of sugars to sustain the firing, and so there will be more radioactive sugar that accumulates in that part of the brain. And areas of the brain that are burning less sugar will have fewer sugar molecules accumulating in that part of the brain.
Let me ask you a question, sir. The radioactive sugar that's injected, you said, that's what you're talking about, this, no, you know what it means. What's that half-life you were saying? It doesn't last long? And
Yeah, it's about approximately 2-hour half-life.
Okay, and so when someone goes in for one of these procedures, that dosage of that injection is actually delivered the very morning, right before, theoretically, they put into the machine or injected with the radioactive sugar, correct?
Yes, you have to make a fresh batch of the radioactive sugar molecule every day because it won't last a day. And so every day, the cyclotron is fired up to prepare a new batch of fluorine-18, which the radiochemicals then attach to the sugar molecule for that day's, for those patients that day.
There's services in the medical community that pick this radioactive material up, know how to transport it safely to the imaging center?
And yes, so there are special delivery trucks, and they have special lead containers that are used to carry these, and they distribute these to hospitals from the cyclotron facility. And so they'll be driving throughout the city with these special lead containers to carry the radioactive sugar molecule to various hospitals.
All right. Ready for the next one?
Sure. And so the next slide shows after the radioactive sugar molecule is injected into the patient, it takes about 30 minutes for the radioactive sugar molecule to settle in. So it's kind of like one of those old-fashioned Civil War photographs where you had to sit very still for 30 minutes, or you have to have the patient, lying for 30 minutes, not doing anything before the sugar molecule can settle in. And after that period of time, the patient can then be transferred into the scanner, and you can see that this is what a typical scanner looks like. It looks like a giant donut, and the patient's hole goes inside the hole of the donut. And if we move on to the next slide, please.
Actually, I just want to ask you a question
Sure.
first. The downtime after the injection of the radioactive sugar, that the downtime, the sitting still, however relaxed, is to let the radioactive sugar flow through the body's system?
And to settle into the parts where areas of the brain that are firing are going to accumulate more sugar, areas of the brain that are not firing are consuming less sugar. So you don't want to have the patient, for example, like singing or dancing, because then you can see areas of the brain that are involved with speech or motor, So you want to have the patient basically lying still for 30 minutes approximately.
Does it have to be 30? Can it be more or less?
It can be more or less, but that's an approximate rule of thumb.
All right.
And so if we move on to the next slide, please. So here we see a schematic, and this shows the positron emitter, and emits the positron, and you'll see that that's represented by the E+. And it will combine with some negative electron in the brain, the E-. And then the mass in the positron and the mass in the electron are transformed into pure energy using Einstein's famous equation E equals mc squared, and they come out as energy rays that shoot off at 180-degree angles. And so you have these energy rays emanating from the patient's brain, and they are detected by these crystal detectors. And so you see these green crystal detectors, and these green crystal detectors are specifically tuned to detect the energy rays that are created by the matter-antimatter energy transformation process. And as soon as two crystal detectors go off, there's what we call a coincidence circuit that's built into the machine. And so the computer will say, aha, two crystals went off simultaneously. There must have been two energy rays that shot out that just tripped these two crystal detectors. And so the computer, in effect, will draw a line between those two crystal detectors. And then when another energy ray pair comes out, it will draw another line. And so basically, the PET scan involves millions of intersecting lines. And areas of the brain that have large sugar are going to have more energy rays emanating from that part of the brain, and there'll be more intersecting lines from those areas of the brain where there's a lot of sugar being consumed, and areas of the brain that have fewer sugar metabolism will have fewer energy rays emanating from that part of the brain. There'll be fewer intersecting lines coming from those parts of the brain. And so if we can move on to the next slide, please.
Mike. No, one more. Judge, maybe we could take a short break to figure out why it froze up.
You need what?
I don't know if you want to take a short break so we can figure out why it froze up.
Okay. Want a break?
Well, it looks like it may take a second.
All right. Why don't you all step back into the jury room?
Wait a second, Judge. Sorry.
You got it?
This is the beginning. I know, back to the other way. Where we started.
Yeah, that's where we want to be.
Right here?
Yeah, uh-huh.
Okay.
Okay.
All right.
No break.
Sorry, sir. Sorry, Jerry.
Back to your seats.
All right. So what are we looking at here, Dr. Wu?
So this is a schematic of a PET scan. And so you'll see that there's all these crystal detectors, and there are rings of these crystal detectors and thousands of crystal detectors, and they're all sort of tied together with coincident circuits. So whenever you have two energy rays emanating from the matter-antimatter energy transformation process, they trip these two coincident circuits, and so the computer basically keeps track of all these intersecting lines to figure out how much sugar is being consumed in different parts of the brain. And if we can move on to the next slide, please.
So the rectangles along the outside of the circle, those represent the crystals you were talking
Yes,
about?
those are little crystal detectors, that's correct.
Inside the machine?
Yes.
Mr. Nappy, can you go up there and help him? You see that update is going to come up every 10 minutes. So why don't you change it to like 2 hours or something like that? No, up one more, yeah. There you go. You may proceed.
And I think we've already covered this, and the PET scans are generally accepted. They've been around for decades now. Thousands of articles have been published using PET scans to determine how much sugar is being consumed in different parts of the brain for different conditions.
Okay, what are we looking at here, sir?
So this is an example of PET scans being used clinically. And so Medicare now pays for PET scans to look at patients with memory disorders like Alzheimer's disease. And we know that with Alzheimer's disease, most MRI, CT scans are very insensitive at detecting early signs of Alzheimer's disease. But PET scans are very sensitive at detecting early signs of Alzheimer's disease because in early stages of Alzheimer's disease, one of the first areas of the brain to start burning less sugar is the bilateral, or called temporal parietal area. And so the area that's labeled 5A normally will be more red, but in an age-matched normal, and so you can see an age-matched normal control that without Alzheimer's, there's a lot of sugar being consumed in that area, but in the person with early Alzheimer's disease, there's a lot less sugar being consumed in that area, so there's less red. So that's just one example of how PET scans are used clinically for example, look at Alzheimer's disease.
Right, so the picture, the image on the right, 5B, that's someone that's volunteered or whatever, but known to not have Alzheimer's, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
All right, so they get that picture, and then on the left, you're comparing that to someone who I guess has been diagnosed with Alzheimer's and then has gone through a PET scan?
Yes, that's correct. And you can see that, and so this is a person with a normal MRI. The radiologist measures the MRI is normal, but a PET scan is definitely abnormal and is clearly a sign that this person has Alzheimer's disease, even though the MRI was normal.
All right, and so the one on the left that has a lot less of the red area, that's where you're saying on that particular individual, the brain is not functioning correctly?
Yes, and it's helpful because we know now that there are certain medications that can slow down the progression of the disease, and so with early diagnosis, there are various medication combinations like Namenda or Aricept or things like that that can slow down the rate of decline. So early diagnosis can be very helpful.
Right. Again, that's non-surgical.
Right.
Okay.
Right. And so this is just a three-dimensionally rendered view of the PET scan. And so this is when you take the two-dimensional slices and stack them on top of each other, so you can see what they would look like in 3D. And you can see that in the patient with Alzheimer's disease, it is this area of blue, which is low metabolism, in the temporal parietal area compared to a normal control that doesn't have that bluish area with low sugar metabolism. And so this is an example of how PET scans can be used in Alzheimer's disease.
The front of these brains is to the right, correct?
That's correct, and the back is to the left, and you have the cerebellum at the bottom.
All right, so it's very common then that people with Alzheimer's have this decrease temporal?
Yes. So it's a pretty common finding, and it's very sensitive, and it's much more sensitive than MRI CT, and probably actually more accurate than a lot of neurologists actually. People have actually done studies comparing neurologists' ability to clinically diagnose versus a PET scan's ability to detect, and PET scans are actually more accurate than many neurologists that are actually picking up signs of early Alzheimer's disease.
So these machines assist doctors all over the country to diagnose and ultimately treat people with Alzheimer's and other...
Yes, they can be and are being used for that purpose throughout the country. That's correct.
Okay, I think you talked about that. All right, actually I need to back up for a second. Okay, so in this particular case, it's Mr. Toledo. Are you aware that he was taken from the jail at some point to an imaging center to have a PET scan done of his brain?
Yes.
And in fact, did you travel from California to come and monitor or view his procedure?
Yes.
All right. And after he had his PET scan and you went back to California, did you receive some reports and documents relating to his PET scan?
Yes, I received what we call a CD, which has the digital imaging data in DICOM format. DICOM is a universally accepted format for medical imaging data, and so that's what I analyzed.
All right, and since you were there and observing all the things that you showed earlier about the patient with the radioactive sugar, the laying down, the waiting, all that is the same protocol that was used for Mr. Toledo, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
All right. And after you had a chance to, back in California, review the records from the imaging center and study them, did you memorialize that in some type of report?
Just so the viewers know, are you going to show them the evidence now?
Yes, sir.
Okay, folks.
Instead of using that paper report, it's been put onto this format, and I'm going to put it up on the screen.
Okay, so folks, this will be in the jury room. Well, actually, they won't have it unless it has to be viewed in the courtroom, okay? But this will be evidence that you need to consider, okay?
Thank you, Judge.
Right, and I'm talking about but this portion of the PowerPoint.
Correct. The disc from the imaging center and his report relating to it.
Very well.
All right. That's the cover page of your report?
Yes.
All right. And just for record purposes, where it says, after his name and his date of birth, what did you put in there?
Well, I put in the scan description and scan finding. The scan was of good technical quality, and visually, when I eyeball a scan, without doing any statistical measurement, he has a decrease in the frontal parts of his brain compared to the back part of his brain. And so this is what I noted in my visual analysis.
All right. And your impression was what?
That this was an abnormal scan, and that clinical correlation is recommended.
Inclusion into the...
Yeah, so the pattern is consistent with brain abnormalities such as brain injury, clinical correlation is recommended. Records can be forwarded for correlational purposes.
All right, now clinical correlations recommended, is that layman's terms? You need, it'd be helpful to see some other records, historical type records?
Yes, in order to better understand and interpret what this means, it's helpful to have medical records of the patient to try and see how this ties together.
All right, ready for the next slide?
Yes.
All right, so what are we looking at here, sir?
So this slide shows Mr. Toledo's scans. And let me orient the jury to the way the scans are formatted. And so in the top, so the scans are formatted so that they're going from the bottom of the brain in the top left corner to the top of the brain in the bottom right corner. And so you're going from the bottom of the brain, and each column going up progressively higher. And so if you look at a specific brain, like let's say you look at the third row, and you look at the first column, and you were to impose an imaginary clock face on that brain, so that the area from 10 o'clock to 2 o'clock would be what we call the frontal lobe area of the brain here. And then the areas from 4 o'clock to 8 o'clock would be the back of the brain, the post-occipital lobe areas of the brain. And the area of the brain that goes from 2 o'clock to 4 o'clock or from 8 o'clock to 10 o'clock would be the temporal lobe areas of the brain. And so these are abnormalities that we see in Mr. Toledo, and he shows a decrease in the frontal lobe compared to other parts of the brain, such as the back of the brain, on the visual analysis.
So if you go like from the third line, from the top down, is that where you kind of see that the best, where there's
well, I would say it's probably actually better seen on the second row, and if you look into the second and third columns of the second row, you'll see that there is the area that's from 10 o'clock to 2 o'clock is sort of greenish, and the back of the brain is more yellow-reddish, and if you look at the second column and the third column of the second row, you'll see that there's more green and less red, yellow in those areas of the brain, the frontal lobe, compared to the back of the brain. And so, so this is what my visual analysis of the brain read.
All right. I put the next slide on.
Okay. And so in the second stage of my analysis, I use what is called a statistical analysis of the PET scan, where I look at the PET scan and divide it up into a series of, where I compare each voxel or pixel in that particular area with a normal control population, and determine if that particular voxel or pixel is abnormal or not. And I use what we call a statistical threshold, so that we're not just looking at noise. And this is something that is a clinically accepted method. It's something that is part of the procedure guidelines for brain PET interpretation, is what's called observer independent effects, because this is something that is independent of any observers. Because with a visual analysis, you can have two different observers both see the same scan and say, well, based on my clinical experience, I don't see anything wrong with this. You know, and another one might say, well, I see something wrong with this. But with a statistical analysis, it's what we call observer independence, so that this will always show the same abnormalities if they're present, no matter who's running the test. And so it's in some ways a more objective test that can be used to assess a brain scan. And this is something that is a clinically accepted tool, and it's especially helpful in forensic cases where it's very important to try and get some kind of reliable, objective assessment of the scan, not just have two different expert witnesses butting heads.
All right, so just to make sure I understand that, then with the visual analysis, you would agree, I guess, under certain situations, two people with different opinions could have a different opinion, but when you do this second part where you're using the statistics, the numbers don't lie and they are what they are.
That's correct. And so this is no matter which expert does it, if they do the statistical test and use the same normative population, the same threshold, they'll get the same findings. So this is why they call it observer independent. And so if we move on to the next slide, please.
Yes, sir.
We need to take a break at some point in time.
We can do it right here, Judge.
Right now?
Yes.
Okay, we'll take a 15-minute break.
All right.
I think everyone may be seated at this time. Okay, you may proceed.
All right, thank you, Judge Zambrano. All right, Dr. Wu, this was the screen we just put up when we took a break. What are we looking at here?
Well, so this is a quote from recognized textbooks, Functional Cerebral SPECT and PET Imaging, which indicates that visual analysis of PET images may not be sufficient to uncover subtle metabolic disruptions to neural function. More objective methods for examining FDG PET data would be helpful. SPM has been used to address these issues. And so this deals with the point that sometimes you can have different expert witnesses who might do a visual analysis and call it different ways. But when you use a statistical analysis, it's a more objective method of detecting abnormalities. And it's something that is a recognized tool that can be used, and is one that I find important in these kinds of cases.
All right, what are we looking at here, sir?
So this is what we call a statistical Z-map analysis of Mr. Luis Toledo's brain, which shows areas of brain that is statistically abnormally low. And if you look at the area, then you'll see there are certain black spots in the first row, in the fourth and fifth column, in the area right around 12 o'clock. There's
Top row, correct?
The top row, yes. And so I've blown up that image in the next slide, but it's hard to see when you're looking at all the images. And so if we can move on to the next slide. And I've measured that area of the brain using a technique called region of interest measurements. And this is an accepted tool in PET scanning. And so I measured the region of interest in Mr. Toledo, and I measured this in normal controls. And I also count, and so the mean for normal controls for that area of the orbital frontal lobe is 1.33 units. These are relative metabolic units. And the standard deviation for the area is 0.12. And so this area of the brain has a standard deviation that is minus 2.5 standard deviations below the normal control mean, and so it falls below a commonly used medical threshold of P less than 0.05. It's a 1.2. It's a P equal to 1.2%. And so this is a statistically abnormally low area of metabolism in the frontal lobe, and this is something that is noted on a statistical measurement which is observer independent. But it coincides with my visual analysis read. So when I read this visually, I didn't do the statistical analysis, but I said, visually, this area of the brain looks lower compared to other parts of the brain. And when I do this statistical analysis, the statistical analysis provides objective corroboration that there is an abnormal decrease in the orbital frontal lobe area of the brain. And this is a kind of decrease that we see in individuals who have sustained traumatic brain injuries. This is actually a common area of the brain, because this is the area of the brain that sits on top of what we call the cribriform plate, which is kind of a rough surface of the brain. And so when you have someone who's, for example, like Luis, who was in a motor vehicle accident when I believe he was 16 years old, and he was I think, at ICU for several days to several weeks. It's not clear. Some records say several weeks, some say several days. And he had significant cognitive deficits after this motor vehicle accident. I mean, this is a kind of a metabolic defect in the frontal lobe that I see in patients who have been in motor vehicle accidents. For example, in personal injury, civil cases. So this is exactly the kind of deficits I see, and it's the kind of thing that we see statistically. And it's the kind of thing that is, and accepted tool. If you look at the procedure guidelines, there is an addendum that says observer independent methods, and they describe the use of statistical parametric maps as a clinically accepted tool as part of the procedure guidelines. And so this is something that clinicians can use, and some clinicians do use it. Most clinicians don't bother to do statistical analysis. I'm one of the few people who do like to use this regularly. And so statistically, we're seeing with this observer independent analysis that there is a statistical decrease in the frontal lobe consistent with his history of having been in a serious car accident when he was in the hospital for several days to several weeks, and consistent with his complaint of significant memory and other problems that developed. And so, and so this is and we know that this is an important area of the brain because the orbitofrontal lobe area of the brain is an area of the brain that's very involved with social regulation. There's a very famous case in neuropsychiatry called Phineas Gage, and this was a man who was helping to build a transcontinental railroad, and his job was to tamp explosives in using a tamping rod into holes that were drilled into the ground, and then it would set off these explosives to blow up the rocks to help build the railroad. And when he was tamping some explosives, it went off prematurely, and the tamping rod went right up through his orbitofrontal lobe of his brain, and miraculously he survived. But he showed a dramatic change in his personality thereafter. Whereas before he was a very responsible, mature, considerate individual, after this he became very crude, aggressive, impulsive man, and that was actually one of the beginnings of the field of neuropsychiatry. This is a seminal case in the field of neuropsychiatry. And the lesion that Phineas Gage has is almost the exact same spot as this black spot that Mr. Toledo has on his PET scan. It's an area of the brain that's involved with things like judgment and impulse control. And so he shows a deficit in the same area that Phineas Gage showed in this very famous case in neuropsychiatry. And so...
Hold on, Doctor.
Yes.
Make sure you're giving us a lot of information here. Okay, so take 1 second to absorb some of this. That picture, that image up there, that is an image from the PET scan of Mr. Toledo's brain, correct?
Yes, and this is what we call a statistical Z-map analysis, and what we call observer-independent analysis. And the black area are areas of brains that are statistically abnormal in Mr. Toledo. And so though that area of the brain is an area that I measured using a technique called region of interest analysis. And then I compared that with my normative population and then determined how statistically aberrant this area of the brain was in Mr. Toledo. And so this is the kind of decrease in frontal activity that we see in individuals who sustain significant traumatic brain injuries from things such as motor vehicle accidents.
All right.
And
all right. I just want to ask you a couple questions.
Sure.
Okay, that is Mr. Toledo's brain. Now,
Yes.
the black on there, is that from the imaging center, or is that something that you've indicated on there where the damage is?
this is what we call a Z-map analysis. So with a Z-map analysis, the program will place a black spot in areas of brain that are statistically abnormal.
Okay.
And
So there's a computer software program that enables that to occur, correct?
yes, that identifies the areas of abnormality in what we call an observer-independent fashion.
Right.
So it's independent of which expert runs the software. No matter which expert ran the software, you would still get the same finding.
All right, and so where you have this score chart on the right and the Z-score, that's what, that negative 2.5, whatever that means in the medical science world, that's supposed to be the normal range?
Well, the negative Z-score is what we call a standard deviation is. That's how many standard deviations below the norm this region of interest is in Mr. Toledo. And so a commonly used threshold is 2 standard deviations. And so Mr. Toledo exceeds that threshold. So for example, if you're looking at things like white blood cell count, white blood cell count is up to 10,000 is normal. But if you had white blood cell count of 15 to 20,000, that would be considered abnormal, and that would have like a Z-score that would be, like a minus 2.5, minus 3, or actually plus 2, plus 3, depending on how you measure it. So Z-score is a statistical measure of how aberrant this region of interest measurement is in Mr. Toledo compared to a normal population.
All right, and so that's why you were saying earlier in your testimony, instead of just a visual, when you put the mathematical equations into it, it makes it more standardized and more consistent for everyone. Correct?
Yes, it is independent of any observer, and it is reliably consistent. No matter which expert ran it, you will get the same finding if you did ZMAP with a normative control population at a predefined threshold. And so he shows area of the brain is almost a third lower than normal. This is a clinically abnormal decrease.
All right, I'm going to go back for a second to the slide before that, if you can. So which one of these is the one that we were just talking about?
So if you look at the
top right?
The first row and the fifth column,
Okay.
That image is the same, except that it's blown up in the next slide.
Okay.
And so that is the image that shows the decrease, a statistical decrease on the ZMAP.
All right, and I want to try to go back if I can find that. Okay, this is the visual one?
So the top, this is what we call ZMAP analysis, addendum 1, and is what we call a quantitative ZMAP analysis. And so the black spot is a quantitative ZMAP analysis. And if we go back to the visual analysis, that would be 3 slides earlier.
Okay.
And so that would probably roughly correspond on the visual analysis to approximately the second row, second column.
I'm not sure I'm following you. So the second from the top?
The second row, second column.
Going right to left, the second column?
Yes, and so you see that that's the area that's sort of greenish there, and so that is an abnormal level of metabolism statistically.
Okay, and then when it comes out in this version, it looks with the red, and then you
Yes, and so the system analysis will identify the region that is abnormal.
All right. Ready for the next slide?
Yes. So the next slide is what we call a statistical ZMAP that shows what we call abnormal increases in metabolism. And if you look at the top row, and you look at the second and third and fourth and fifth image, you'll see that there are black dots that are present. Let's see. Is it possible for me to point them out on the monitoring with my finger to the jury, or is there like a laser pointer or a pointer stick I can use to point the black dots out to the jury?
I don't think the laser pointer works, and I don't believe you can use it like a telestrator, but if the judge would allow you to step down for a second, or... I could use his written form, and he could stand in front of the jury and point. Oh. Judge, Dr. Wu, if you could step back here, Your Honor, with his court's permission, I think with the cursor or that mouse thing, he can show it.
Okay, so if you follow the cursor, you'll see that there are these black spots here and here, here and here, here and here, here, and then here and here, and then there's some black spots back here, black spots here, black spots here, black spots here, and black spots here. And so these black spots are areas of the brain that are statistically abnormal increases. They're too hot in terms of sugar metabolism. And so what we're seeing here is what we call a temporal overactivity in these areas of the brain. And the temporal overactivity is what we call bilateral in the temporal lobe areas on the bottom, and then they become what we call lateralized, so that they become more on what we call the patient's left side. It's the image right side, but the patient's left side here and here. And what we're also seeing is some concomitant activation of subcortical structures, so that there's a connection between the caudate, which goes to the temporal lobe. There's a loop called the striatal-palatal cortical loop. And so when you have an area of the brain that's overactive in the cortical area, it is connected to parts of what we call striatum. The striatum is kind of like a switchboard of the brain. If you remember those old-fashioned telephone operators that used to have switchboards where you would patch people in, well, the striatum is kind of like the switchboard of the brain. So what we're seeing here is that this switchboard of the brain, you're seeing that the right caudate here, where I'm putting the cursor, and right caudate here, and right caudate here, these are all active on the same side as you're seeing this increased activity in, it's actually the left caudate. It says right side of the image, but left caudate as a temporal lobe. And again, this is all consistent. There's a hyperactivity in that area. And this is something that's very consistent with what we call non-convulsive seizures. Okay.
While you're walking up there, let me ask you a question. Those black spots on these scan images, that's not something you just draw in. That's from the computer software program you talked about?
Yes, and so this is placed there by the Observer Independent Statistical SPM-Z map, which procedure guidelines and textbooks indicate is a clinically accepted tool that can be used to identify abnormalities in an observer independent fashion.
All right, and you were just segueing into how it may relate to seizures.
Yes, and so if we can move on to the next slide, please.
One more?
Yes, so this is a blow-up of one of those slides. And so what I've done is I've measured the region of interest metabolism in Mr. Toledo and compared them with normal controls and looked at the mean and standard deviation of the normal control population. And Mr. Toledo has an abnormal increase in activity in those parts of the temporal lobe area of the brain. So this is 2.59, and so this is less than 1%. It's a 0.009% probability of occurring by chance alone. And so this is a kind of abnormality that we see in individuals who are engaged in what we call non-convulsive seizures. Now, Mr. Toledo had a history of seizure disorders that began when he was 3 years old. He's been hospitalized for seizure disorders. He's been on anticonvulsants off and on. Now, seizure disorders can evolve over time. And so in his childhood, seizure disorders were more what we call tonic-clonic, motor seizures. And so, for example, when he was 9 years old, he was hit in the eye, I think playing baseball, and he went to what we call tonic-clonic seizures, and he was taken to a hospital. But they can evolve into what we call non-convulsive seizures. And non-convulsive seizures are characterized by an overactivity of metabolism in temporal lobe regions, like we see in Mr. Toledo on his PET scan. And we know that non-convulsive seizure disorders, you can have what we call like a low-grade non-convulsive status epilepticus, where you have seizing basically in the brain, even though you're not having motor seizures. And this can have profound adverse emotional and behavioral and cognitive deficits. And we know that individuals can have an exacerbation of their non-convulsive seizure by emotional stress. We know that emotional stress can heighten the severity of the seizure in the brain, so that what is kind of a low-grade status epilepticus can go into a full-blown non-convulsive status epilepticus, which can have profound impact on how a person behaves, including profound breakdown in their ability to regulate aggression and impulse behavior. And so he has symptoms of, he has objective signs on PET scans consistent with a non-convulsive seizure disorder. There's an abnormal increase in the temporal lobe of the brain, and consistent with his history of having seizures since he was 3, having the seizure disorder when he was 9 again, when he, and so even though he doesn't have motor seizures, it's clear from his PET scan that he has a pattern very consistent with someone in a non-convulsive status epilepticus.
All right, so this is the one a few back, that's showing his damage to his brain on the frontal lobe, And then this one is the damage to the brain to the temporal lobe, correct?
Right, and the damage to the frontal lobe was an abnormal decrease in sugar metabolism, but the damage to the temporal lobe was an abnormal increase, because when you're seizing, the brain is overactive, and even though you might not be seizing motorically, it is affecting the emotional circuits, because the temporal lobe have lots of emotional circuits, including the amygdala. The amygdala is a key part of the temporal lobe, and the amygdala is a key part of regulation of aggression. So when you're having a seizure in the brain, that's going to directly impact one of the key components of the brain that is responsible for the regulation of aggression.
So, Dr. Mings, Dr. Moore, you described that given his PET scan results and using the historical information, you mentioned that stressful situations could trigger or evoke unusual responses. Would an example of a stressful situation that could do that be learning that your wife was having an outside marriage relationship?
Yes, knowledge that a spouse is having an affair is one of the most stressful experiences that a person can experience. And this can certainly exacerbate someone with a non-convulsive seizure disorder and trigger a full-blown status epilepticus of the temporal lobe area of the brain. And I've seen this in other cases where individuals engage in all kinds of bizarre aggressive behaviors after they have discovered some terrible emotional news which triggered the temporal lobe seizure in the brain and caused them to do some bizarre, aggressive, terrible behavior, which they would probably never have done if the stress had not poured fuel on the flame of the temporal lobe epilepsy.
Well, yeah, but the other side of the coin is if the, a normal person without these problems that he has, learns of an affair, they're not going to perhaps do something silly or aggressive, where people like these results are not necessarily true.
That's correct. An individual who has a seizure of the temporal lobe is when there is a long history in neurology of patients with epilepsy having significant problems with aggression because of their epilepsy. People used to only think that epilepsy involved motor epilepsy. And then in the last 10, 15 years, there's been astonishing advances in the field of neurology where it has become very evident that there's a large number of patients who have what we call non-convulsive seizures or status epilepticus that are missed because they don't have the classic motor signs. But when you do tests like PET scans or EEG scans, you can detect it. So that's why neurologists now, and there's a big literature on this, have found that there are a number of psychopathological behaviors associated with non-convulsive seizure disorders where patients might engage in something bizarre and aggressive, and especially when they're in the middle of a full-blown status epilepticus that is non-convulsive.
Right. And so based on your experience in this field and so forth, if someone as a younger person would suffer from grand mal seizures, the very physical in nature, but they seem to dissipate over time to some degree, does that mean that they still may not be suffering from these non-convulsive seizures, or you could still, even though you've stopped maybe exhibiting major grand mal seizure, you could be still suffering from these non-convulsive seizures?
Yes, it is very clear from the neurological literature. Anyone who's familiar with the neurological literature and is up to date on this will know that you can have what we call non-convulsive seizures that a classic tonic-clonic childhood seizure can evolve into. And these are often misdiagnosed or underdiagnosed because many neurological physicians are unaware of some of these advances in the field of neurology and unaware of the fact that you can have non-convulsive seizures. But it's only with tools like PET scans or with things like EEG that you can actually document and find objective evidence that these are present, because non-convulsive seizure disorders, they don't have tonic-clonic symptoms, but they can have things like impaired attention, they can have impaired behavior, impaired emotions, and so there's a lot of psychopathology that people are realizing is neurological, and we know that stress can profoundly exacerbate non-convulsive seizure disorder.
All right, so we're kind of talking about two different areas of his brain, the seizure area on the temporal lobe, and then this impulse or other type of control in the frontal lobe. You've given an example to me before about the frontal lobe and used this analogy of brakes on a car. Can you just explain?
Yes. So just like Phineas Gage, when he had the tamping rod that went through the orbital frontal lobe area of the brain, the brakes on crude, impulsive, aggressive behavior was destroyed or damaged. And so we know that the orbital frontal lobe acts like the brakes of a car. They help to inhibit the acting out of aggressive, angry, impulsive behaviors. I mean, everyone has feelings when they get angry, but you have a brain which is function which enables you to inhibit your acting out of that behavior. But if the brakes of the car are damaged, you're not going to be able to do that. It's like the circuit breaker is wiped out, you know. And like if you're on a car and it's speeding and it's going down a rapid sharp curve, and you have to tap on that brakes. If the brakes aren't working, you're going to crash through the guardrail. You're not going to be able to slow down your ability to act out if those parts of the brain which regulate aggressive impulses are damaged. And Mr. Toledo has abnormal decreases in the orbital frontal lobe area of the brain, which are the brakes of the brain's engine, so to speak, in terms of acting out, preventing the acting out of aggressive, angry impulses.
All right, sir. Do we have any other slides for your presentation?
Yes. So Mr. Toledo has an extensive history of multiple traumatic brain injuries, an extensive history of seizures going back to the age of 3, an extensive psychiatric history. So that we know that he had a seizure disorder that began when he was 3, that he had a possible concussion when he was 6, that he was hospitalized again with seizures when he was, I think, 11, that he was in special education classes for emotionally handicapped when he was 12, that he was in a car accident when he was either in the ICU for 4 days to 4 weeks with difficulties with memory and concentration when he was 15, that he had episodes of suicidal behavior, including cutting himself when he was 16, that he had a gunshot wound to his face and head when he was 18, that he was diagnosed on multiple occasions with having mood disorders, when he's diagnosed with bipolar disorder or schizophrenia, and he's been treated with antidepressants, anticonvulsants, antipsychotics, and that he's had episodes of auditory hallucinations and episodes of suicidality. And we know that traumatic brain injury can increase the likelihood of having mood disorders like suicidal behavior. We know that it can damage emotional regulation. We know that traumatic brain injuries can damage reality testing, so that you can have episodes of auditory hallucinations. Now, that doesn't mean that the reality testing is impaired all the time, but it means that you can have episodes when reality testing goes on a blink and you're hearing voices. And so his history is consistent with someone who's had multiple complications associated with traumatic brain injury, and so if we can move on to the next slide, please. Let's see the slide after this. And so the decreased frontal lobe, this is the kind of thing that I see in patients who have sustained a history of traumatic brain injury. And as mentioned, he's had multiple episodes when he ran into a wall at 6, when he was hit in the eye at 11, and started to have seizures again when he was 15, and in the ICU when he was 18, suffered a gunshot wound. So he's had at least 4 separate occasions when he has sustained injuries that would have been sufficient any one of them by themselves that could have caused an overall frontal lobe decrease of the types that I observed statistically on his PET scan. And
sorry, let me ask you about the last entry on there, the gunshot wound to the face and head. We heard testimony yesterday that most of those wounds ended up being more superficial, although he still has some metal fragments in his head. But even if he didn't have massive outside bleeding or things like that, could he have still sustained a brain injury from that gunshot?
yes, so just being shot in the face and the head, even though the bullet doesn't penetrate the skull and go into the brain, there is what we call rapid acceleration deceleration because, of course, the bullets are traveling at a very high speed. And when they hit your head, your head's going to accelerate very rapidly. And we know that rapid acceleration deceleration in and of itself can cause significant damage to the brain. So just because he doesn't show the bullet penetrating the skull and actually entering the brain doesn't mean that it didn't cause a brain injury. A gunshot wound in the face and head would certainly be potentially significant acceleration deceleration to cause what we call axonal shearing traumatic brain injury. And that's just one of multiple instances where he's had that could have accounted for this. Now, I don't know which, if any of these, it could have been just one of these things caused the abnormality, could have been some combination of all of them. It's hard to know exactly when the abnormality occurred, but any one of these, in and of themselves, could have been sufficient to have caused this kind of abnormality in the frontal lobe. And
You want to talk about the next one?
yeah, and we know that brain injuries, once you're damaging the brain, you're going to have a lot of what we call impulse problems. And so this can lead to things like greater likelihood of abusing drugs because of impulse problems. And it can lead to depression, where people sometimes try to use things like alcohol to try and self-medicate. It can lead to anxiety disorders. And so we know that patients who sustain traumatic brain injuries are at much higher risk for developing addictions, in part because in many cases they're trying to self-medicate, and in part because their ability to regulate impulses and make proper judgment is impaired. And we also know that it is going to increase the likelihood of mood disorders like depression, suicidal behavior, and it's going to increase the likelihood of having episodes of psychoses, episodes of auditory hallucinations. And so there are multiple complications that can occur, and he's had multiple instances of brain injuries, all of which could have resulted in a much greater likelihood of developing all these other complications.
All right, and they, at this point, when there's medicines and so forth that patients can be given to help ease these symptoms, correct?
Yes, so for example, we know that mood stabilizers can help with depression. There's an anti-anxiety medication that can help with anxiety disorders, that there are medications they can use to try and help with attention problems. And so there are a number of different treatments modalities that are available to try and treat patients who have developed complications from brain injuries.
All right, and can people with these situations under control of medicine function basically at a normal level?
Yes, if you've had complications such as mood disorders or anxiety disorders or attention disorders stemming from a brain injury, we know that proper medical treatment can make a world difference in terms of helping patients to function more normally, to behave more normally.
What if you're someone who has these conditions and you're supposed to be taking your medicine to control these feelings and you stop taking your medicine? Will you revert back to where you were?
Yes, you're likely to have a significant regression and likely to have a significant what we call decompensation.
I put to the next slide, or Dr. Wu.
Okay, so we know that he has a history of mood disorders and of being treated with hospitalized in psychiatric hospitals. I think even in childhood of having suicidal symptoms, even at the age of 12, that he's been on and off antidepressants and in and out of psychiatric hospitals for years. That he's had episodes at times when he's had psychotic symptoms and auditory hallucinations, and being treated with antipsychotic medications like Geodon or other things. And we know that stress can exacerbate these kinds of symptoms. We know stress can make him more likely to be depressed. stress can make it more likely for you to have auditory hallucinations. And we know that if you're not stressed, you may be less likely to have, going back to childhood, of multiple neurological psychiatric treatments and hospitalizations in and out for all different kinds of complications.
All right. What do you have here in the next slide?
Well, as I mentioned, the prefrontal lobe is very involved with lack of judgment, what we call disinhibition. So that we know that individuals who have frontal lobe damage are what we call disinhibited, that they can't inhibit aggression anymore. They are much more likely to have a loss of control, they're much more likely to be impulsive, they're much more likely to have an emotional outburst of some sort. Again, this is something that's well established in the neurological literature going back decades. And so frontal lobe damage is associated with impaired impulse control and impaired reality testing.
What is it, just for record, what's the Benson 1984, Damasio 1987, and Loria 1980, what does that mean?
These are all prominent neurological articles, textbooks that have all been commenting that the frontal lobe is very important. So if you have damage to the frontal lobe, you're going to have acting out. And if we move on to the next slide, please.
The head injury study?
Yes. So if you look at the, so for example, one of the things that people have done is they've looked at Vietnam veterans who sustained head injuries. And they found that the Vietnam veterans who had head injuries, brain injuries to the frontal lobe of the brain, were more violent than Vietnam vets who had the same size injury, but to other parts of the brain, like the parietal or the occipital lobe area of the brain. And so this is just, I mean, there are hundreds of these kind of articles that show that the frontal lobe is very important for regulating impulsive and violent behavior. And when it's damaged, you're going to have problems regulating that behavior. And so this is just, this is one of the most famous studies that have actually controlled for the size of the lesion. And they looked at Vietnam vets, and they say, okay, well, if you have a lesion that is, 3 millimeters by 3 millimeters by 3 millimeters in the frontal lobe, and you have another vet with a lesion of 3 millimeters by 3 millimeters by 3 millimeters in the occipital temporal parietal lobe area, and you compare these vets, you'll find the one who has that same size lesion in the frontal lobe is going to be more violent than the vet who has that lesion in other parts of the brain. And so again, this is highly consistent with the fact that the frontal lobe is a critical structure of the brain for regulating behavior. And when it's damaged, the ability to regulate impulsive, aggressive behavior is going to be damaged.
You got something on here from Davidson, is that another?
Yes, and again, this is just a review article that talks about the fact that the frontal lobe is very involved with regulation of aggression, as well as other parts of the temporal lobe. The amygdala is a temporal lobe area, and you'll mention here, it says, discusses more about orbitofrontal cortex amygdala. Amygdala is part of the temporal cortex, and that is another area of the brain that Mr. Toledo has abnormalities in, the temporal lobe area, which is amygdala is part of. And it plays a key role in inhibiting things. I mean, part of normal adulthood is being able to inhibit your impulses. I mean, when you're kids don't inhibit the impulses, And kids, if they're angry, they act out the anger. I mean, part of what happens in maturation is that you learn to inhibit those angry impulses, and part of that involves, for example, the frontal cortex becoming more and more active over time. But if your frontal cortex is damaged, you're going to be like an adult in an adult-sized body, but you're going to have like a kid's level ability to regulate your emotions.
Okay, what's hypermetabolism?
Well, the hypermetabolism, that was an overactivity of sugar metabolism in the temporal area of the brain. And that was something that was observed on multiple slices on the brain. I just chose one slice on the brain to measure, to show that it was abnormal. And so this is something that is seen with what we call non-convulsive seizure disorders. We know that aggressions and psychosis are known neurological complications of patients with epilepsy disorders. And we know that hypermetabolism of the temporal lobe is seen in the ictal phase of non-convulsive epilepsy. And we know that it's hard to detect, especially because you don't have the classic motor movements. But we know that it's associated with significant behavior disorders, including violent acting out. And we know that it can flare up under emotional stress. We know that emotional stress, like finding out that your spouse is cheating on you, is the kind of thing that's going to make your temporal lobe seizures sort of flare up out of control, and it can cause a catastrophic failure of the ability to regulate aggression and impulses. And we know there are many different causes. He had a seizure disorder since he was 3, and so he could very well have some kind of autoimmune disorders. We know sometimes you can develop seizures in response to infections, and the immune system fights the infection and might damage the part of the brain. Or it could be a genetic mutation, and so we know that all these, so he's had a seizure disorder for decades, since childhood, so his brain shows evidence consistent with non-convulsive seizure, low-grade ictus, All
right, so you described, let's say you or I get in a very stressful situation that temporal lobe starts firing up, but other parts of the brain, the frontal lobe, shut it down, put the brakes on. Yes. People who have these brain problems, their brains may not be wired right. They don't have the ability in all these cases to put the brakes on. Is that fair to say?
That's right. So that if you get angry, your frontal lobe can help say, okay, let's think about the consequences, let's cool off, let's step back. If your frontal lobe is damaged, and if you have a seizure disorder, it's like pouring gasoline on a fire, it's going to flame out of control, and you're going to have a catastrophic failure of the ability to regulate aggression and impulse.
All right. You got a last slide here?
And so this is basically a summary slide, that he had abnormal decreases in the frontal lobe, and that is quantitatively present, and that is statistically present, that you can measure and in an observer independent manner, and that he had episodes like being in ICU for several days to several weeks that would certainly be of more than sufficient intensity to have caused the kind of damage to the frontal lobe that is observed on both visually by my eye, but also statistically, and that the frontal lobe is associated with impaired ability to regulate impulses, impaired judgment, impaired emotional regulation, impaired reality testing. We know that he had abnormal increases in temporal lobe on the PET scan, but we know that temporal lobe metabolism increases during non-convulsive ictal disorders. We know that the non-convulsive ictal disorders can flare up with stress, like discovering that your wife has cheated on you, that he's had a history of seizure disorder since he was 3, and that this is associated with impairments of regulation of aggression and reality testing, and so that's my conclusion.
All right, let me ask you this, sir. Can you think of a circumstance, or I'll just say specifically this case, where you would travel from California, tell the jury and the court all your findings based on your years of training and experience, and come in here and try to perpetrate a fraud or... All right. Dr. Wu, do you believe in your work in this case to be true and correct?
Yes, I believe that it is true and correct. My visual analysis as well as the statistical measurements.
Have you testified truthfully to the jury as far as your work and your findings and all your experience and these things that you've told us about?
Yes.
All right. And would you have any reason to come in here and say something that's not true?
No.
I don't have any other questions, Your Honor. I guess we have to take this thing down.
Good morning, sir.
Good morning.
Now, as I understand, Dr. Wu, just to kind of put it in a nutshell, your testimony here today is that it's your opinion that the defendant, Luis Toledo in this case, suffered traumatic brain injury. Is that correct?
Well, that he has a PET scan abnormality that is consistent with having sustained a traumatic brain injury, and that he has a history that is consistent with having sustained multiple traumatic brain injuries.
Okay, but my question is it your testimony today that he has suffered traumatic brain injury?
I would say to reasonable medical certainty, it is my medical opinion that he has sustained a traumatic brain injury.
And that opinion that he has in the past suffered traumatic brain injury is based on what?
Well, based on the PET scan abnormality as well as the history of multiple events, including being in ICU when he was, a teenager for several days to several weeks.
Okay, well, let me go back because I want to just to be clear, PET scan is not a standalone test, correct?
Yes, you cannot make a diagnosis from PET scan by itself.
So the stuff that you showed us on the slides with the black dots and all that kind of stuff, that's all you had. That's all you had. You could not testify the way you've testified and reach the conclusions that you have reached today without anything else. Is that right?
That's correct. I can say it's consistent with a traumatic brain injury, but I couldn't say without any other evidence that it is more likely than not to be a traumatic brain injury.
Okay. Now, as I understood your testimony, when you were talking about the history of traumatic brain injury, which you said supports your conclusions in this particular case, you referred to an incident that occurred when the defendant was 6 years old. Is that right?
Well, that was one of multiple instances I referred to.
And we'll get to the other ones, but this was one of them. Is that right?
Yes.
And this was one where, as a 6-year-old, he ran into the wall.
Yes.
Okay. Now, you received records in this particular case to review in terms of a history.
Yes.
So you're not basing your testimony solely on these PET scans that you did.
That's correct.
And so this was an incident that happened. He runs into the wall at 6 years old. Did you review any medical records regarding that?
I reviewed Dr. Ming's report in which he...
That's not my question. My question is, did you review any medical records regarding to him running into the wall when he was 6 years old?
No.
Okay. So where did that information come from?
Dr. Ming's report.
And Dr. Ming's got that information from the defendant, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And so the next one that you indicated was, I believe he was hit in the eye with a ball, right?
Yes.
And how old was he when that happened?
I believe he was 11.
Okay. And did you review any medical records regarding that?
Yes.
And was there anything in the medical records that indicated that the defendant had suffered any kind of injury as a result of that?
Well, he started to seize after he was hit in the right eye.
Okay, well, that's not my question. My question is, isn't it true that in the medical records from that incident, there was no indication whatsoever that the defendant suffered any kind of physical injury?
I'd have to review the medical records again to...
Go right ahead, sir.
Okay.
We'll take the time.
I review the records, and much of it's handwritten, so it's hard for me to make out much of it. Let's see. I mean, I see it's playing handball, got hit on the right eye. Went into chronic seizures. With a loss of consciousness of 15 minutes. a loss of consciousness is typically consistent with concussion.
It's also consistent with a seizure, isn't it?
Yes.
Okay. So he was hit in the eye.
Yes.
And it was by a child, another child, right?
Yes.
Okay, another child. I guess the records probably don't say what age the child is, but it's
No.
fair to say it's probably a child his age, correct?
That's reasonable.
Okay. And so there's no indication at all in the records that his eye was cut, that there were any stitches were needed, that he suffered any kind of bruising or contusion or anything like that, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And they didn't do any kind of CT scan, any kind of MRI scan, correct?
That's correct.
And they didn't do a PET scan either, did they?
No.
Because there was no evidence of any injury, correct?
Well, I would say that he went into seizures and had lost consciousness for 15 minutes. So, I mean, I think that that's a significant event.
Okay, but again, there was no indication at all that he had suffered any injury as a result of being hit in the eye with a ball by another child.
Well, I mean, I think having a seizure episode is after being hit, it indicates that it's had to have been sufficient intensity to trigger a seizure episode.
Okay, but again, my question though, doctor, is there is no evidence that he suffered any kind of physical injury as a result of that incident, right? I mean, I think you answered the question, but...
I guess a physical injury, I would consider a seizure disorder, a triggering seizure disorder to be a physical injury.
Okay, but your testimony, doctor, though, is that he suffered, that what you're seeing on these PET scans is that he has, over the course of time of his life, has suffered traumatic brain injury. And there was no evidence in any of these records from this incident that the defendant in that incident suffered any kind of traumatic brain injury, correct?
I would say that traumatic brain injuries are oftentimes underdiagnosed in emergency rooms, and so it's not uncommon to have no documentation.
Okay, but I mean, we're talking about doctors who were with defendant at that time, correct?
Yes, and again, I mean, it's well established that traumatic brain injuries are often underdiagnosed by emergency room doctors.
Okay, my question, though, is that these records that were produced, these are produced by the medical health professionals that were treating the defendant at that particular time, correct?
Yes.
And today, what you're trying to do is reach conclusions about things that occurred all these many years later, correct?
I'm saying that any one of these episodes, including the one when he was in the ICU for several days, several weeks, could have been potentially sufficient to cause traumatic brain injury. But I said I wasn't sure which, if any, of these episodes caused a specific abnormality I note.
Okay, so what you're basically saying here today is that the doctors that treated the defendant at that time didn't know what they were doing, but you today can look back all these many years later and reach conclusions that they completely missed, even though they were treating them at the time.
I'm not saying they didn't know what they were doing.
Well, you're saying that they missed something. Is that correct?
It's not uncommon for emergency room doctors to do, in the normal course of treatment, to miss traumatic brain injuries. This happens all the time.
And you're able to, today, to look back at these records and after this is an incident that happened many, many years ago and reach conclusions that he suffered traumatic brain injury then.
I'm saying that he has an abnormality on his PET scan which shows a decrease in frontal lobe metabolism that's consistent with a history of having sustained a traumatic brain injury at some time in his past, and he's had multiple episodes which could have been a contributing factor, but I said I wasn't sure which, if any of these specific episodes caused a specific abnormality.
Okay, so I guess then you don't know. You really don't know if that incident where he was hit in the head with a ball caused any kind of traumatic brain injury, correct?
Yeah, that's what I stated. I said I wasn't sure which of these, if any of these, including that episode. So I can't say definitively that episode when he was hit at 11 caused this abnormality. I'm not saying that.
Okay. You also said that there was there a second incident where he was hit as a child?
In the eye with a ball?
In the head or anything like that?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay, I believe the next one you talked about was a car accident, right?
Yes.
Now, you kept saying that he was in the ICU for 4 days to 4 weeks. I think all the testimony that we've heard so far was it was 4 days. Where are you getting a few weeks?
Well, if you look at some of the other records by other physicians, some of them say 4 weeks. If you want, I can try and dig up those records, but it will take time.
You got a report from Dr. Mings who talked to the defendant who said it was about 4 days, right?
Yes, but there were other evaluations he had by other treaters in various competency hearings, and some of those recorded 4 weeks in some of those records.
Okay. So this car accident, you had some medical records from that incident, is that correct?
No, I don't have any. I don't have any direct ICU or hospitalization records from that. I have Dr. Ming's report in which he interviewed the patient.
Okay, so that was some more information that came straight from the defendant, correct?
That's correct.
So you don't have any independent corroboration from any medical records that ever occurred?
That's correct.
Now, if those things are not true, then that would affect your analysis in this case, wouldn't it?
It would affect the fact that there's an abnormal decrease in the overall frontal lobe metabolism. I mean, that is still present. It would affect whether or not the incident in the ICU might have been the contributing factor that caused it. So it would affect that part of the conclusion, but it wouldn't affect the first part, which is that there is a statistically measurable decrease in overall frontal lobe metabolism, which is consistent with the history of traumatic brain injury.
It would just affect your ability to be able to say that activity, lower activity, higher activity, whatever, came from traumatic brain injury, right?
It would, if, for example, the ICU incident didn't happen, if he was never in ICU, then that would certainly not be a potential incident that could have contributed to this abnormality.
You also mentioned that when he was 18, he had suffered a gunshot wound, correct?
Yes.
And did you have medical records from that?
Yes.
Okay. Now, I just want to kind of go back. The incident with where he was hit in the eye with the ball, that happened where you did have medical records. That happened 4 years prior to the report that he had been in a car wreck. Is that right?
Let's see. So the incident with the seizure was in 1993 when he was about 11, and then the incident with the car accident would have been about 1997 when he was about 16 or 15.
Okay. So the medical records you had from the ball incident, you had those.
Yes.
Showed no injury. And then after that, though, there's this report of this car accident, and then you have no medical records for that.
That's correct.
Okay. Now, going to when he was 18, you indicated that you had some medical records with regard to this gunshot wound that he had suffered to the face.
Yes.
And you said you had medical records for that, right?
Yes.
And isn't it true that those medical records showed no brain injury, correct?
They don't show any bullet fragments inside the brain. That's correct.
Okay. So was there a CT scan or MRI done?
I think it was a skull film. I'd have to go back to the records to refresh my memory as to whether there was a CT or MRI. Okay. I don't recall that offhand without reviewing the records.
So was there did the medical records indicate in any way that he had suffered a brain injury?
I don't think that they comment on that directly. They focus primarily on the gunshot wound.
Okay. If there had been some evidence that he had suffered a brain injury as a result of that, what would have been some of the things they would have done? Would they have done a CT scan, MRI scan, a PET scan? Would they have done those things?
Well, if there was evidence of a penetrating injury to the skull, they would likely have done a CT or MRI.
Okay, but none of those things were done, right?
But there was no evidence of a penetrating fragment that broke through the skull into the brain.
Okay, but so my question is, none of those things were done. CT scan, MRI, PET scan, none of those things were done.
That's my understanding, my recollection. That's correct.
In fact, the records essentially describe the injuries as soft tissue injuries, correct?
That's correct.
All right. Now, I know that you were asked some questions about that, about how there could still be some kind of effect on the brain, right?
Yes.
We don't. But there's no evidence of that, right?
There's no comment on that in the records that were documented at that time.
Okay, but the records show that the defendant was treated by doctors at the hospital at that time, correct?
Yes.
Do you think that they missed something at that time?
Again, traumatic brain injuries are missed all the time by ER doctors, so
Okay.
that's quite likely or possible.
They possibly missed it, but here you are all these years later, you figured it out, right?
Well, all I'm saying that he has evidence on his PET scan of an abnormal decrease in the frontal lobe area of the brain consistent with some episode of traumatic brain injury, and that there could have been any number of possible instances, including gunshot wound, a car accident, being hit in the head with a ball that caused a seizure, that could have caused it. It could have been none of those. It could have been some other incident, but he does have some abnormality in his frontal lobe that's very consistent with a traumatic brain injury.
You just don't know, right?
I can't say specifically which incident caused the abnormality. I'm saying that he's had multiple instances, any much of which could have caused the incident, but it could have been something else.
Now, Dr. Wu, I understand, I think you were already asked some questions about that. You have testified quite a bit of times in capital
Yes.
cases, right?
That's correct.
I know that you had mentioned that you had testified at least over 100 times total. How many times have you testified specifically in capital cases?
I say probably about slightly less than half are in capital cases.
Okay, how many is that approximately?
I'd say roughly 40%.
Okay, you got, I'm asking for a number. Can you give me kind of a ballpark?
I would say at a minimum 40 cases.
Okay. Approximately how many times have you been retained to review things with regard to a death penalty case?
I would say at least 40 times.
Okay. So you've testified in every single case that you've been retained in?
No.
Approximately what percentage of times have you actually testified in cases that you're retained in?
I'd say 95% of the time.
Now, and all of those have been for the defense, is that right?
Yes.
And isn't it also true, Dr. Wu, that in just about every single case that you've been retained to review PET scans, you found some sort of brain abnormality, is that right?
I would say it's a very high percentage, but I would say if you look at the kind of patients who are referred to me, these are patients who generally have well-documented neurological or psychiatric histories, including episodes of traumatic brain injury or seizure disorders or bipolar disorders, schizophrenia, so it's not surprising that the kind of patients that are referred with these kind of disorders have abnormalities in PET scans.
Now, PET scans, people have heard of those before. I mean, there are doctors, other doctors that do PET scans or review PET scan images, correct?
Yes.
In a variety of contexts, right?
Yes.
What are some of the most prevalent uses of PET scan technology?
Tumors, I would say, is probably the most common use.
Okay. And I think you already talked about Alzheimer's, is that right?
Yeah, Alzheimer's is another potential use, yes.
Disease.
Yes. Parkinson's disease, that's common, I would say.
Okay. And those are the most commonly accepted ways that PET scan technology is used, is that right?
Seizure disorders is a common, it's especially pre-surgical evaluations.
And there are doctors in Florida that actually do PET scan work, review PET scans, make opinions based on their review of PET scans. Is that right?
Yes.
Now, I want to talk to you a little bit about moving from the discussion on traumatic brain injury. I want to talk to you a little bit about the seizure disorder. Now, in this particular case, you indicated that you described, I think, what you referred to as a non-convulsive seizure disorder.
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Now, in this particular case, there was a history of the defendant as a child suffering seizures, right?
That's correct.
And these were the type of seizures that would manifest itself in an obvious way to those people that were around him, right?
Yes, like when he was, I think, 11, he started having tonic-clonic seizures.
Okay. Did you actually ever review medical records that discussed that, where he was taken to the hospital? I think we've already talked about one where he was hit in the eye with a ball. Right?
Yes.
Okay. Now, over time, isn't it correct that those seizures did not manifest itself in that way?
That's correct.
And they weren't what most people would think of as a seizure.
Right, and then he stopped having overt motoric seizures.
Okay. But after your review of the PET scan, you believe that he was still having these non-convulsive seizures, is that right?
Yes, because he has an abnormal increase in activity in bilateral temporal pole on the more ventral. That's evident on the statistical parametric map. And he has abnormality on the left temporal lobe, left caudate, and posterior thalamus. I mean, this is it ties in more anatomically with known circuitry of the sort of striato-thalamo-cortical loops.
Okay. So now that he doesn't manifest those outward seizures, it has to be non-convulsive seizures, correct?
That's correct.
Has to be that because
He's not having overt motoric seizure. That's correct.
it's also true, though, that a lot of people who suffer seizures early on, they don't have either type of seizure. Is that right?
It's possible you could stop having seizures altogether, yes.
You're not even having non-convulsive seizures.
That's correct.
But in this particular case, your conclusion is he had to be having these non-convulsive seizures.
Based on the abnormal increase in the bilateral temporal poles ventrally and the left temporal and left caudate and the posterior thalamus, yes. I think that's a most likely explanation for this abnormal increase in those specific regions.
So if a person is having one of these non-convulsive seizures that doesn't manifest itself outwardly, what's going on inside of them?
Well, it can manifest as what we call absence seizures, where you have kind of like a sort of a episode where you kind of like stare off into space and you kind of blank out, and these are subtle. I mean, a lot of times people don't notice these things, and you can have what's called, and so that's probably the most common manifestation, what we call absence type seizures, where people sort of blank out and just stare off.
Okay, is that it?
No, it's accompanied by a number of emotional and psychiatric components. So you can have impairments in reality testing at times, including auditory hallucinations. You can have impairments in emotional regulation, including depression. You can have impairments in impulse control. You can have impairments in other things. You can have sensations like what you call tactile sensations, like feeling like insects or ants are crawling underneath your skin. You can have olfactory hallucinations where you feel like you can smell something other people can't smell. You can have things like deja vu, where you feel like you've been someplace you've never been. I mean, there's a whole host of less known, less overt symptomatology that's evident in these kinds of disorders.
Is that it?
Well, I mean, there's a whole host of other symptoms. There are checklists that you can go through to ask about these things. I can't remember everything on the checklist.
Now, and so it's your opinion, is it not, that the defendant at the time that this event occurred, I think you spent some time talking about finding out that his wife had been cheating on him and there being some type of altercation. Is it your opinion today, Dr. Wu, that in that moment, when all of this occurred, that the defendant was having one of these non-convulsive seizures?
I think he has a low-grade chronic non-convulsive seizures, and it is well known that significant emotional stress, like finding out your wife is cheating on you, can exacerbate these and cause a full-blown flare-up or exacerbation.
My question, though, is that your testimony today that he was having a non-convulsive seizure when these events occurred?
It's my medical opinion that is true for good medical certainty. Yes, I think that was probably true.
Okay. Did you ever talk to the defendant at all about this case?
No.
Did you talk to him about the events that night?
No.
Okay. You didn't. You flew to Florida to monitor the PET scan. Is that right?
Yes.
So you met the defendant before today, is that correct?
Yes.
And you had an opportunity to talk to him, right?
Yes.
But you didn't ask him at all about anything about that night when all this occurred?
No.
You didn't ask him how he felt
No.
when he killed his wife?
No.
I mean, you understand that he admitted to killing his wife, right?
Yes.
So you didn't ask him what was going on inside your brain, what were you feeling at the time?
No.
Don't you think that would have been important?
Well, my role was to do a PET scan on him, and I wasn't. My primary role was not to interview him.
Okay. But you're looking at a lot of records, and you're drawing conclusions about what you think happened that night. You said you believe this to a reasonable degree of medical certainty. But wouldn't it have been, the best evidence of this would have been talking to him about how he felt and what was going inside his body, inside his mind at the moment all of this occurred?
I mean, that would be additional information that would have been useful or helpful. I don't think it was essential.
But you didn't do that, did you?
No.
And so you're basing your opinions on these medical records and your own, things that may or may not have happened in the past to reach your conclusions today.
And based on the PET scan, the fact that he has an abnormal statistical decrease in the orbitofrontal lobe and has an abnormal increase in the temporal lobe, and that these things are, the abnormal decrease in the frontal lobe is consistent with history of traumatic brain injury. It's the kind of thing I've seen in other patients with traumatic brain injuries, and an abnormal increase in temporal lobe is the kind of thing that I see in other patients with non-convulsive seizure disorders.
But the bottom line is that whatever you see on those PET scans, you do not know with any degree of certainty exactly what was happening inside his mind at the moment that he killed his wife and his children, right?
No, I do not know exactly what's going on inside his mind at the moment of the killings.
Because you didn't ask him.
That's correct.
Nothing further.
Thank you. Any redirect?
Dr. Wu, did you review any records from Louis Toledo's birth, his hospital stay and his birth?
I reviewed a number of records, including childhood records and multiple other psychiatric and neurological records. So I don't recall specifically the record you're talking about. I'm not sure which record you're referring to specifically.
Okay, well, I don't think you have one. Is it possible to get a brain injury during birth?
Yes, that's very common. You can have birth complications that can result in brain injuries, which can increase the risk of seizure disorders.
All right, and you didn't see any of the records from when he was a little boy at 3 and had the seizure disorders because none were provided to you, correct?
That's correct.
There's reference to those records, though, in other reports.
That's correct.
Do you have any reason to doubt that the seizures started at 3 years old just because you don't have a report of it?
No.
All right. Is it a surprise to you, Dr. Wu, that people who have been convicted of crimes like he's been convicted of ultimately get referred to you? Does that surprise you?
It's not surprising because the patients referred to are generally ones with well-established psychiatric and neurological histories. And it's known that PET scans are very sensitive at detecting neurological psychiatric abnormalities. So, for example, schizophrenia or depression, where there are certain abnormalities that are evident by, schizophrenia, decreased frontal lobe. Or,
in fact, in this case, as well as all the other cases that you've done, you don't even get involved until the patient has been through a battery of other tests from other experts, and then you come into the picture to correlate what they have found. Isn't that correct?
I'm usually the last one who's called after there's been multiple other neuropsychologists, neurologists, psychiatrists who have all documented multiple abnormalities or symptoms or injuries.
Right,
so those are the kind of patients that refer to me, ones that have been through a wide variety of other screenings.
Okay, so you don't go first, find an abnormal scan, and then we get in all the other doctors. It's the other way around, correct?
That's correct.
All right, and sir, you were asked if you interviewed Mr. Toledo. Did the defense team for Mr. Toledo ask you to interview him?
No, you asked me to do the PET scan and to review records.
All right, do you typically interview patients while they're getting a PET scan?
No.
I don't have any other questions, Ron.
Thank you. Any redirect?
But talking to the defendant about what was going on in his mind that night would have been the best evidence of what was going on in his mind that night, rather than reviewing these records, right?
It would be additional information that would be helpful, yes.
Nothing further.
All right, thank you. All right, thank you. May the witness be excused. Defense? Okay, all right. If you'll step down, Doctor. Can I have counsel sidebar real quick? Off the record. All right, folks, as you recall, I called you last night and told you that we will be working tonight. It's my goal to get as much as we can done today. So what we're going to do is we're going to shorten our lunch hour to only 1 hour. So I'll be back at 1:45, and we'll start the lunch right after lunch. Remember not to talk about the case with anyone, okay? And counsel, get your witnesses here, okay?